Go, Andrew. Sorry, cat invading here.
There we go. Um, I'm very glad to meet everybody and to be invited to speak here tonight. It's I think I spoke to this group in 2008, and it was one of the nicest uh, evenings I had had. Just giving a talk that evening and meeting everybody. So I'm excited to speak with you again tonight. Um, as Lisa in her very kind introduction indicated, my research is on plant biodiversity fairly broadly. I do a lot of work on oaks and have more in the past, but still currently do a great deal on sedges as well. Um, but tonight will be less about research. There will be some research tossed in, but mostly about the natural history of the plants. Um, and I hope I will endeavor to leave time for questions. I confess that I packed a lot of slides in here because I want to show you a lot of species in variety contexts, but I'll happily take questions. If there's anything that isn't clear to you, one of the things that I find alarming about speaking on Zoom, though I'm getting used to it, is this fact that I'm speaking, I have no idea what people are thinking. I like looking out at an audience and seeing people's eyes glaze over. I don't like seeing them glaze over, but I like to know when people's eyes are glazing over. If you're confused or want me to slow down on anything, please signal me in some way so that I know.
I would suggest that if you want to interrupt, just put something in the chat and then we will pass that on to,
That's great. If somebody's moderating the chat, that is the easiest way. Thank you very much,
we'll
Jerry.
moderate it.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see if this works. I'm always fearful that it won't. Are you seeing my slide presentation now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So this presentation is entitled "The Sedges You Know, the Sedges You Don't." Carrick's the Chicago region in ecological context. It's really more about sedges of the upper Midwest writ large. And this, of course, is Carrick's Pennsylvanica, in of all places. Uh, uh, oh no, this was this was a day that I saw it growing on the streets. This was actually in Maple Grove Forest Preserve in DuPage County. Okay, first of all, so this talk will have three sections. First, what are sedges? A little background information. Second, the lion's share of the thing will be about the sedges themselves, an introduction to various species in their habitats. And then the third section, the very end, we'll talk about a little of the phylogenetic work we've been doing as a consortium, the Global Carrick's Group, which has been up and running since 2011, aimed at understanding why there are so many sedges. So first of all, what are sedges? When we talk about sedges, let's start with the family. The family Cyperaceae. When you say sedge,
Andrew, we've
yes.
had a request that you speak a little louder.
Okay, can you hear me? Is this a little bit better?
Yes, that's good.
And let me clear things away from my computer. I have no idea where the microphone is on this computer either. I'll lean into the screen, so I'll be creepily close and maybe a little bit louder. So Cyperaceae comprise about 5,500 species. This makes the family of sedges the 9th largest plant family in the world, with 260 species in the Chicago region. What characterizes the family? When you're in the field, you can recognize it by its leaves, which are in 3 ranks. So here we have Dulichium, right, with the 3-ranked leaves looking like they're coming off the tips of a triangle. So many sedges have edges as a consequence of this 3 ranking. The leaves form a sheath like you find in grasses, but the leaf blade comes down and the sheath wraps around and is generally closed, like a crew neck t-shirt. In grasses, the margins of the sheath are open like a robe or like a shirt that you might button up in most of the species. In the sedges, they're closed like a t-shirt. And the ligule, this little flap of tissue that is loose in grasses, is adnate or fused to the inner surface of the leaf blade in the sedges. And the third characteristic is that in the sedges, each flower is subtended by or has beneath it a single scale. That makes it different than the grasses, where you get this proliferation of scales with specialized names, glooms, lemmas, paleas, and different than the rushes, where you get the flowers subtended by 6 tepal, like structures, little bracts. So typical of family members of the Cyperaceae, Cladium mariscoides, the twig rush, the spike rushes like Eleochus rostulata, which is a fascinating spike rush. You'll find this in fens. You see all these loops here. Eleochus rostulata grows up and is flattened like this so that it arches over and then roots at the tips so it can walk across the fen. And as you're walking through the fen, you invariably trip over these things because they grab your ankles. Things like the cotton grasses, like Areophorum. Things like the bulrushes of Scirpus cyperinus, or woolgrass rather. Okay, so that's the family Cyperaceae. The talk today is going to focus on the genus Carex, which is about 2,000 species worldwide. When you say sedge, most people in our country are talking about Carex, typically, not always, but Carex are the typical sedges. What characterizes them? One important structure, this sac-like structure that surrounds the female flower. This is called a periginium or a utricle. So you have the single scale subtending the male flowers, the single scale subtending the female flowers, but this specialized bract that is closed makes a sac called the periginium. That's what makes a carex a carex. And they're magnificent structures. They've shielded the achenes inside from natural selection, so the achenes are dull in carex, but they're fascinating in the other genera. But the periginia are highly variable. So carex intumescens with these swollen periginia, likely adapted for flotation. The bright orange carex aurea periginia, which are tasty to birds and humans alike. And the swollen bases of Carex pedunculata that form an eliosome that ants will feed on, take that seed back to their nests and plant just like they would any of the other woodland herbs with eliosomes like the trilliums. Now, you may have heard of some other sedges that have periginia that are not in the genus Carex. Until about 6 years ago, there was a group of about 100 species worldwide that had periginia, like this Carex fraseriana, that until 6 years ago was called Cymophilus, its own genus, its own species in its own genus. A publication that we put out in 2015 took all of these genera, Cymophilus, Cobrigia, Uncinia, Schieneziphium, and packed them into Carex. And they all have the same feature. They all have a periginium. So it's become much simpler. Making Carex just a little bit bigger made the world more simple. If you have a periginium and you're a sedge, then you're a Carex. Straight and simple. Okay, so let's watch over some of the features of the sedge body. You don't have to memorize any of these, but I might use some of these terms in the talk. And just in case you're not familiar with them, here they are. So let's start at the bottom. Carex has roots just like any other plants, and all carices, almost all, with very, very few exceptions, have rhizomes. These are creeping stems that run underneath the ground, and they're for vegetative reproduction. Some are exceptionally long and slender, like you find in Pennsylvania sedge. Some are short and stocky, like you might find in like Carex sprengelii, sprengle sedge. Then as you move up, the leaves wrap around the stem to form sheaths. So here's a leaf sheath right here. And then they give off to blades. There's a leaf blade, just like a grass in this respect. Now, the stem of a grass, a sedge, a rush is often referred to as a culm, C-U-L-M. That's nothing more than just the stem of a grass, sedge, or rush. As you move on up, at the end of the culm, you find the inflorescence. The inflorescence begins at the lowermost leaf of the inflorescence. That's a bract, right? So all the leaves within the inflorescence are called bracts. It's just a specialized term for a leaf within the inflorescence. And then there are spikes. There's a lateral spike, and by definition, there can be only one terminal spike because terminates at the very end. Okay, Now, once you get up to the inflorescence, there's a little proliferation of features that are worth knowing. Spikes can have a few different types. They can be all females, all perigynia. Those are called pistillate spikes. They can be all boys, right? Just stamens. Those are called staminate spikes. They can have boys at the tips and females at the base. Those are called androgynous. Or they can have females at the tip and males at the base. Those are called gynocandrous. So the spikes are this unit of inflorescence, the unit of the inflorescence of the sedge. Now, within that inflorescence, then, you have several structures. One is the scales. We talked about those already. One scale beneath each flower. If it's a boy flower, it's a staminate scale. If it's a girl flower, it's a pistillate scale. The perigynium is this sac-like structure that surrounds the female flower and has the seed inside. Actually, the fruit, it's a little nutlet. Popping out of the tip of the perigynium, you may find the stigmas, right? These are the surfaces that the pollen lands on and that stimulate the pollen to grow a pollen tube to fertilize the seed inside. And of course, if it's a male, they have stamens. Okay, briefly, I would be remiss not to let you know that the classification of carex has been kind of confusing for over a century. Its last global revision was in 1909 by Kukenthal. Tamara Villaverde, who's a postdoc in our lab for a couple of years, developed a phylogenomic framework for a brand new carex classification. If you are followers of the Indiana flora, you may know Paul Rothrock. Paul Rothrock has an Indiana carex book coming out this summer, I expect. It's in proofs. It's in revision right now. I believe that he's following this new classification. His work, incidentally, it was done by Tamara with Marlena Hahn, our research assistant, and Enrique Mejia, who visited us for several months at a time. Okay, briefly, what does this show? This work took the whole genome, took like 500 and some genes across the genome, and came up with a really robust phylogenetic tree. Whether you're interested in that or not, here's what the outcome was. There are 6 subgenera now in carex. 4 of them are in our flora. 2 of them are rather small. You might recognize this species. This is Carex leptalia. It's a unispicate species. It's in the subgenus Euthyscerus. And this is Carex jamesii, a rather common mesic woodland species. It tolerates disturbance, has the cutest little perigynia. They're round with a little conical beak. That's in the subgenus Uncinia. Those guys are the rarity because they're unispicate. They have a single spike. All the others of the other 2 subgenera in our flora have multiple spikes. So Vignia has these flattened perigynia with only 2 stigmas, and Core Carex subgenus Carex, has a huge proliferation of species. This is the largest part of the genus. Now, you can forget all that. I will not be dwelling on this. If we were taking a course in Carex, I would be focusing on this. Instead, what I'm going to do for the rest of the time is I'm going to focus on the ecology and the habitats and the morphology of the species, what they look like, how they behave, where you'll find them, the things that I think about when I'm walking in the woods, and the things I think about when I'm deciding what to plant in my yard. But this is an important background for you if you want to go on and spend more time learning sedges on your own. Okay, so let's go to the meat. That was bun 1. We'll have a bun at the beginning, a bun at the end. This is the hamburger. It's a big, thick hamburger. This is the Carex by habitats. It's a walk along moisture gradients with some of my favorite carices. So first, let's start in wet prairies, right? So let's look at, here's Goose Lake Prairie, for example, with Carex bicknellii. This is a member of Carex section ovales. These are species with really distinctive flattened perigynia. In this picture, you can see that they've got these little flattened scale-like perigynia. Sorry, this is a little fuzzy. We'll get a crisper photo in a moment. If you break the spike open, this is an illustration by my wife, Rachel Davis, who illustrated our sedge book. You'll see a few of these in here where I think they illustrate key features. Break them out, and what you find is that the perigynium is flat flat like a pancake. And inside it, there's a little lenticular, lentil-shaped achene. In Carex bicknellii, the margins are this sumptuous, deep, to my eyes, honey brown. They're just a rich color, and the inside surface of the perigenium is translucent, so you can see inside. There's that dark dot there. That's the achene. You can see the achene right through the belly of the perigenium. Very distinctive species. You shouldn't mix that up with anything else, and it'll grow well in wet to mesic prairies. In similar habitats, you find Carex molesta, a wonderful scientific name because it means troublesome, which people feel is probably true of most sedges. Again, these flattened perigenia, but unlike Carex bicknellii, which had fairly open inflorescence and brownish margins, these perigenia stay sort of green all over, and look at the spikes, are like little spheres. Very typical to have no more than 4, but in the Chicago region, you often get more than 4. Don't know why. And then Carex scoparia, another member of Carex section ovales with flat scale-like perigenia. It often favors sandier soils. So not surprisingly, here I found it in Hoosier Prairie. You can find it over in Indiana Dunes too, in wet prairies over in Indiana Dunes. Not real common in the Chicago region, but it's scattered throughout the region in wet prairies. Very slender perigenia. By contrast, a species that you might find growing with it in wet sandy soils is Carex annectans. Unlike these long, slender perigenia of Carex scoparia, Carex annectans perigenia are nice and short and stubby. You can get a sense for that when you look at this spike. You look at this spike, and from a distance, you'll see Carex annectans extremely rigid. The lower spikes look like they're kind of lumpy. It's because they're compound. This one spike has 1, 2, 3 lobes. That's very common in Carex annectans and some of its relatives. The perigenia, oh, this is a dreadful photo. I'm sorry about this. This is an old photo. Short, stocky perigenia with a picular, tiny little beaks. Here we'll see it in comparison with Vulpinoidea in just a moment. Vulpinoidea is a very similar species. You'll find it here it is in the Platte, Illinois. This is much more common in northern Illinois than annectans is. Annectans doesn't find the sand soils it wants as much in northeastern Illinois as it does in Wisconsin. Carex vulpinoidea has much longer beaks than annectans. It also has much longer leaves. Take a look. These are my old sneakers from about circa 1995. If you look at the leaves on Carex annectans, you run your hand up from the base of Carex annectans up to the tip. What you find in Carex annectans is that you run out of leaves before you run out of culm. In Carex vulpinoidea, you run out of leaves and culm about the same time. So in this illustration, you see Carex vulpinoidea with these great big long leaves. In some cases, the leaves are much longer than the culms. And look at the difference in the beaks. Here's Carex vulpinoidea with its relatively long beak, Carex annectans with its squat, short little beak, just like that. Okay, staying in wet prairies now. You'll see that there's high diversity in the wet prairies. I mean, people talk about sedges as being wetland species. They're much more diverse than that, but they're really most abundant in wetlands. Carex polita, one of my favorite sedges. You may have learned this in the past as Carex lanuginosa, which is a much more beautiful name. It's unfortunate that we lost it. I don't remember what the reason is for losing lanuginosa, but they both mean the same thing, hairy. And when you look at the perigenia of Carex polita, here from UW Arboretum in Madison, here from the West Chicago Prairie, they look like little peaches. Absolutely exquisite. Just the hairs on them are short, perfect, they're bristling all over. In the same habitats, you'll find, by contrast, a species that has completely smooth perigenia and a sort of waxy covering on the perigenia. It almost gets glaucous. That's Carex buxbaumii, characterized in part by having a terminal spike that is, a term that you learned at the beginning, Echinocandrus. Look at this terminal spike. Looks like an ice cream cone packed full of perigynia. Delicious. But what's going on here is the basal spikes, the basal scales, the lowest scales on the spike, are actually staminate scales. They have stamens in them. Stamens don't take up any room, right? All they are is a filament and little anthers at the tips. All I got to do is make pollen. But the pistillate flowers, they take up room because they have a perigynium that may have some inflation associated with it or some fleshy tissue, and then inside the achene, they've got all this work to do. So the perigynia swell out at the tip, giving it this flaring look, this sort of ice cream cone look. Technically, the term people use for this base is a clavate base. It's like the handle of a club. I prefer to think of it as an ice cream cone. And here it is with a spider, a totally gratuitous spider. Sorry, I just thought this was a beautiful slide. And look at the colors on this thing. Such a nice species. It wants, however, real good calcareous wetlands. It's not going to do well in a typical wet prairie that I know of, like a rain garden, I don't think, unless you have some limestone in there. But anyone who's growing it, if you've got it growing and it's happy, I'd love to hear it. At the base, look down at the base of this plant, and you'll find that it has a characteristic that you'll find in some other wetland sedges. The bases of many of the wetland sedges are red, with the leaf sheath disintegrating to form these ladder-like fibrils. So as the leaf sheath disintegrates over time, what you're left with is a ladder of fibers going up the stem. Can you see those there? It's very typical of Carex buxbaumii and some other species that we'll see momentarily. Okay, as long as we're on calciphiles, I can see I was in a calcareous mood when I did this section of the presentation. Carex cryptolepis, one of the really outstanding species of our flora. This is from UW-Madison Arboretum, where I found it after they had scraped them all to put in a boardwalk. And I was a ranger, and I was so angry that they'd gone in there and scraped this ground to make this boardwalk. I'm like, what are these people thinking? But the positive thing that came out of it is when they scraped the marl, we got just a proliferation of Carex cryptolepis, which is a gorgeous thing. Look at these weird perigynium tips bent down like this. In fact, they're really more than just bent. They kind of arch like this. And it's close relative to Carex flava. Carex flava, the tips go off and they arch and they almost come back up again, like the snout of some exotic, beautiful Carex-shaped animal. Now, more common, so Cryptolepis we don't find very much in the Chicago region. More often we will, however, find Carex granularis. This is an interesting species. I don't have a good slide of this feature, I don't believe, but granularis is part of a little group of species called the granularies. Now, first of all, how do you recognize this thing? This species looks like the perigynium are all packed densely in there, like kernels on a cob of corn. There's no other species that I can think of where the perigynia are so densely packed, and it has this terminal spike is staminate, so all boys, and it's very short. It's embedded right near the base of the first lateral spike. So that's how you recognize the thing in the field. Plus, it often has bluish, waxy, or glaucous leaves. But what characterizes the granularies, this species, and also Carex crowii, which looks very much like a granularis with slightly slenderer and looser lateral spikes and a great big long stalk on the terminal staminate spike. Look at that thing. It's like a giraffe's neck. But what characterizes both of them and the rest of the species in this section, they have little granules of pigmentation in their scales and the surfaces of their perigynia. Now for this, you're going to want to use your hand lens. So take your hand lens and use it properly. So get your hand lens here. And to see this, you're going to want bright lights. My lamp here will not do it. You're going to need to be out in the sunlight or use a real illuminator. Bring that hand lens up to your eye, right? Don't do anything like this. Don't do this sort of thing. You won't see anything. Bring that hand lens up to your eye and bring the scale right up to it. And if you got bright enough light, you should see little flecks of like red coloration in there. Those are the granules, after which the granularies, Carex crowii, Carex granularis, are named. Now, they grow in habitats with a look-alike species, Carex conoidea, right? You're going to look at this, you're going to say, Andrew, that looks a lot like Carex crowii, which you just showed us, only with fatter spikes. And I couldn't disagree with you on that. But look at the perigeny closely on this. Let's see if I have a close-up. I don't, I'm sorry. If you get a close-up on these perigenia, most perigenia have veins, right, going around them. In Carex conoidea, those veins are deeply impressed. It's like instead of raised veins, someone has taken an etching needle and scratched the veins into the surface of the perigenium, and they're glossy. It's a really cool species. It doesn't like it. It doesn't mind disturbance. It does very well with disturbance, whereas these guys are a little bit fussier. They like nicer habitats. And again, in these wet prairies, you'll occasionally find something that looks a little bit like all of these species, but with much looser spikes and a more bluish glaucous hue. This is Carex titanica. It's a nice long rhizomatous species. Scrambles around in, I've seen it in West Chicago Prairie, if you're from around here. And of course, it's in UW-Madison Arboretum, where a lot of my photos are, because that's where I really started to learn sedges when I first got into this line of work. Okay, so we've done the wet prairies. Let's go up to the drier prairies here, because this is Raymond Road Prairie in Madison, Wisconsin. A terribly blurry photo, sorry about that. Carex medii, which looks a lot like Carex titanica. This is a kissing cousin. There's Carex titanica in the wet prairies. Carex medii, usually in these dry goat prairies. This is a very thin soil prairie with limestone right underneath it. You find Carex medii up there, but unfortunately, you will sometimes find Carex medii down in the wet prairies as well, right? It's bimodal, so it likes dry calcareous prairies and wet calcareous prairies. And between there, it doesn't do so much hanging around. People do sometimes grow it in mesic prairies if they've got, I guess, calcareous enough soils. Okay, so now we've moved up the uphill. We're now in dry prairies still. In dry calcareous prairies, you will often find Carex richardsonii. It blooms very early in the spring, and it gets these frills of anthers that almost look like flags, right? Very distinctive, and reddish coloring on the sheaths of the bracts that subtend the inflorescence. So they're right there, right there. Then when you look at the perigenium, get the perigenium underneath your hand lens. Again, remember, bring the hand lens up to your eye. Bring the perigenium up to the hand lens. You'll find a little peppering of hairs on the tip of the perigenium. That's typical of Carex richardsonii. This is a species that's often missed. You don't find it a lot in the Chicago region. I've seen, someone sent me a photo just the other day of it. I can't remember where they found it. But Carex richardsonii is more common than people realize because it's flowering when people are not thinking of the prairie flora so much. In these same habitats, you'll sometimes find something that looks a little bit like a Pennsylvania sedge, if you know that species, but with short spikes. This is Carex umbellata. Carex umbellata loves these calcareous prairies, thin soil, lots of limestone close to the surface. In these habitats, look for something that looks like that has spikes on long stalks and spikes on short stalks, some buried right in the leaf bases. And the bases then are nice and fibrous. It's likely to be Carex umbellata. Now, if you find something like this and you live in really sandy soils, truly sandy soils, like silica sandy soils, that might be Carex tonsa. So you want to look for both of them. Staying in the upland then, as you get into the black oak savannas and also sand prairies, there's a magnificent sedge that many people don't learn. You can also find it in the Rocky Mountains of all places. It's Carex cicada. Has a horrible name. It's a common name. It's called running prairie sedge, which is just kind of a mundane name for a really lovely species. When you find it growing out in these prairies, it forms it can form almost monotypic swards. This is on the West Grady Tract of the UW-Madison Arboretum, underneath a stand of black oak, perhaps mixed with Hills oak, that was the subject of a cool restoration experiment by Virginia Klein many, many years ago. Anyway, Carex cicada would be a great thing to grow if you have truly sandy soils and you wanted to get some kind of a sod going, not a sod you'd walk on. Areas of this prairie that are trod upon regularly, the Carex cicada doesn't last, but the rhizomes on that thing are magnificent. We once took a trail out, moved a trail, and within just about a year, all these Carex cicada had come in and invaded the trail with big, long rhizomes. Really cool thing.
Andrew?
Yes.
We have a question. Is Carex richardsoniana short like Pennsylvania sedge?
Yeah, it's relatively short, and it's different though. So for one, you don't tend to find it in the same habitats. If you're in a truly calcareous prairie and you're seeing something and you think it might be Pennsylvania sedge, start thinking of Carex richardsonii and look for those reddish bracts. But it will be in stature, not unlike Carex richardsonii. Another thing that will distinguish it though is as like with Pennsylvania sedge, where the inflorescence dies back and then you're just left with the leaves, you get the same thing happening in richardsonii. But whereas in Pennsylvanica, you get this ragged mop sort of lying on the ground. That, I mean, not ugly or anything like that, but just sort of stringy thing. In Carex richardsonii, you get more of like a splay of yellowish leaves. So there's a very different vegetative habit. Okay, if that didn't answer your question, let me know. Okay, so in these same habitats, these sand prairies, you'll also, if you're lucky, find Carex muhlenbergii. Carex muhlenbergii is a big, husky species. It forms clumps, like, with bases this big around, and the stalks all, you see how these columns all look like they're rigid and going off in all directions? It does that. It stands straight up and just flops all over the place. And it's like the stalks have yardsticks in them. They're so stiff. And the heads are really these sort of big and sort of, I don't know, they're sort of clunky looking. I don't know how to describe it exactly. They've got, they don't look quite like anything else in our flora, though they are reminiscent of, and you could mix them up with Carex cephalophora, right, which is much more delicate. Oh, I don't know why I have cicada here. I'll get back to, things are jumbled here a little bit. I'll get back to cephalophora. I should have put cephalophora here, but I'm organizing this by habitat. So cephalophora is in the woods. But we'll think about this. Remember this look of Carex muhlenbergii. We'll talk about it again when we get to cephalophora. There's a cicada again. I guess just to convince you that it's beautiful and it grows with muhlenbergii. Okay, now you're asking about Pennsylvanica. Yeah, so here are the perigynia of Carex pennsylvanica. Also, hairy little fellas. Right there it is, doing its thing. You can see the staminate spike up there. And then below it, you see the perigynia, and they look soft, partly because they're a little bit out of focus, but also because they're genuinely fuzzy. That's typical of Carex pennsylvanica. And look at those rhizomes. I mean, really, this is a powerful species. You think about the power of plants to move mountains, or at least sidewalk cracks, and put cracks in your basement and stuff like that. Well, that's these rhizomes will go through the soil like nobody's business and knit it together. It's part of why there's such important species for our ecosystem, is they hold the soils, they build the soils. And this species is also very important for carrying fire through forest understories. And here it is, which I include just because it's a lovely illustration. Showing again, here's the inflorescence, the terminal staminate spike, a lateral pistillate spike, a lateral pistillate spike. The one perigenium with lots of little hairs on the upper, on the distal 2/3 or so. And then here's the plant with its long rhizome, just truncated here because it was from an herbarium sheet. And you see these fibers at the base, like Carex umbellata, which we looked at earlier. This plant also has distinct fibers at the base. So does Carex sprengilii. We may look at that later too. Now, people sometimes in woodlands will mix up Carex pennsylvanica with another wispy species. There's Carex radiata. Carex radiata is a very common grassy looking species in forest understories. If you see plants with clumps of slender leaves and there's no fibers at the base of the plant at all, begin to think of Carex radiata. That's a horrible photo of it. But Carex radiata here, spreading out all over the forest floor, here underneath the weird sugar maples that are planted at the south edge of the E.W. Madison Arboretum, just south of Curtis Prairie. The plant looks really great when it's flowering. Really, these fancy little stars, and then as soon as it goes to seed, it begins to just go to pieces. As the perigenium mature, they've got a little bit of spongy tissue in the base that causes the perigenia to reflex, and they become very brittle. So if you bump against them, almost like jump seed, right? They flip off and they try and jump off into the woods. So they get kind of ragged looking pretty fast, and within a few weeks, Carex radiata just looks like an elephant stepped on it. It just, every Carex radiata in the woods looks like it's been flattened because it's so wispy and weak. Here it is under really gross magnification, but this shows the perigenia, and you see that bulge at the base. That's that spongy tissue I was talking about. That's what causes the perigenia to reflex, almost like you find in jump seed. Yeah, what is it, Virginia? You guys know what I'm thinking of, the jump seed, the one with the little white seeds that you run across in the woods. This one behaves in a similar way, that as you go up the stem and hit the perigenia, they kind of fling off. Truly an adaptation for dispersal. It's closely related to Carex rosea. The two are distinguished, and you'll find them both together in the woods. Radiata in slightly wetter habitats, rosea in slightly drier habitat, microsites right next to each other. Carex radiata with slender stigmas that may get a little wavy, but they don't coil tightly. Carex rosea, by contrast, look at those tightly coiled stigmas there. That's the distinction between Carex rosea and Carex radiata. So you'll recognize these in the woods. The other thing is that when you see Carex rosea late in the season, it still has some body. It's got a thicker culm, it's got wider leaves, and so it retains a little bit more of its poise, whereas Carex radiata just goes. Now, earlier I alluded to Carex muhlenbergii, and I said it looked like a big, burly Carex cephalophora. Here is Carex cephalophora. Okay, this is a woodland species with tiny capitate heads. Here, this one has 1, 2, 3, 4 androgynous spikes. The boys are just a little cone of scales at the tip. You can hardly notice them. I'm going to race back in time just a moment to compare that with Carex muhlenbergii. Okay, so don't get dizzy. There's Carex muhlenbergii from the dry prairies. Look at how that looks like a big, burly Carex cephalophora. Here's our Carex cephalophora. One distinction between those two is just the perigenia are much more veined, rougher, and larger in Carex gravida. Sorry. Carex muhlenbergii, it's related to Carex gravida. But also Carex cephalophora tends to have a more yellowish look and have these little setaceous bracts, these little almost needle-like bracts in the inflorescence. And here they are compared, right? Okay, now let's move into the woods, which is where I like to spend more of my time anyway. So this is a woodland bottomland forest with Carex woody eye in it, which we'll come back to in a moment. It's a horrible photo of Carex normalis. There's a few sedges that are in Carex sectionovales that are endemic to these mesic forests. Carex normalis in the mesic forest and forest edges, which can become very slender and elongate. This will look a little bit like if you took Carex molesta and you stretched it out a little bit, put a little bit of space between the spikes. That's what Carex normalis looks like. Sometimes there's a lot of space between the spikes. This is a fairly uncommon form. But it is rather variable. It can vary from these very congested forms to very elongated forms. This right here, these three right here, I would say these are typical of Carex normalis. You'll run across these in dry woodlands of all kinds. Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, wherever. A little bit distantly related, actually fairly close related. There's a trio of species that are fairly closely related. This is not the closest species. Carex tenera is a wet prairie species that creeps oddly enough into dry oak forests if it has sandy soils. Carex tenera is distinguished by having these inflorescences that droop like this. They're slightly thin at the base of the stalk, right next to the lowest spike. That causes it to arch over. It can be very beautiful. And then the closest relative of Carex normalis looks like almost an intermediate between normalis and tenera. For years, it was thought to be a variety of tenera. In fact, I see I haven't updated this particular slide. This is now named Carex echinodes. This is work that Paul Rothrock and Tony Reznicek did. This is more of a bottomland species. Okay, now when you find Carex normalis, you will also often find Carex cephaloidea. This is another dry forest edge species. Fairly indistinct when you look at it. You'll look at it and think, oh, there's a normalis, but look at those spikes. If you can look, you might be able to see how these spikes at the very tip, the spike looks like it has empty scales in it. Those are the males, because these spikes are androgynous. The spikes of Carex normalis are gynocandrous. Another thing about Carex cephaloidea, it has very distinctive loose sheaths and fairly green nerve. You see how these sheaths look almost like a pair of baggy pants. We'll see this characteristic again when we look at another species, Carex projecta and tribuloides bits. Carex cephaloidea is closely related to a species that you may know from the rich forest, Carex sparganioides, which looks almost, this is it on the right side. I'm not sure I have a good photograph of it in the field. Carex sparganioides looks like you took a Carex rosea and pumped it full of steroids. Made it grow just about twice its size. Big burly thing with great big spikes on it. I'm exaggerating a little bit. The spikes are probably about that size. Very distinctive, again, with these loose sheaths that you find in Carex cephaloidea, big broad leaves. Okay, now staying in the mesic forests, one of the nicest species with the cutest little perigenia is Carex blanda. You will probably know this. It has fairly broad leaves. They are rubbery at the base. And when you look at the inflorescence here, see how each of the perigenia looks like a little Easter chick sort of leaning out over the edge of its scale? That's the typical look for Carex blanda. It's a close relative of a species that is one of the most prominent species in our woodlands, Carex albersina, with great big broad leaves. Carex albersina is an interesting one. All of our woodland sedges, almost all, are evergreen. So in the middle of winter, you can find green, dead appearing leaves on most of them. They are still actively photosynthesizing underneath the snow so far as we know. But then, so here's the big bedraggled green leaves of white bear sedge or Carex albersina with a little flourishing of green leaves coming up in the spring, right? Look a week or two later, and you get these fairly broad green leaves growing all over the forest floor. This is from Maple Grove Forest Preserve. And then out come the inflorescences. And sorry about the ugly cuticles here. The inflorescences are hidden in these broad bracts that are spathe-like, so they're sometimes referred to as spathes. Again, you see these Periginia, and they're looking a little bit like Blanda Periginia, that sort of chick look. And then late in the season, leaf miners take to the leaves. And so look for these leaves late in July, early August, and you find these traces of leaf miners that have gone through here, eaten their way through, and then popped out at the other end. They almost look like subway maps. Very distinctive. Whether the miner in this species is unique to this species, I don't know. But when it shows up in Carex abercina, it's so distinctive because of the way it follows the veins. Very similar looking species is Carex plantaginia, with these great big broad leaves, more corrugated in appearance. This is a species, this picture I took in the Smoky Mountains with Tom Givish's not Vegetation Wisconsin, his advanced community ecology course in graduate school, but you can also find this species in Berrien County if you get up there to the woods. Distinguished in part by having these purple bracts at the base, in addition to these darker green and sort of corrugated leaves, unlike Carex abercina. So you shouldn't mix the two up. Okay, in these same kinds of forests, now we're still in mesic forests, you find Carex hertifolia, definitely the fuzziest sedge around. If you want a sedge that's going to do well in any kind of woodland setting and is always beautiful to look at, Carex hertifolia fits the bill. Whether you look at it microscopically or macroscopically, it's as though you've taken the whole plant, dipped it in glue, and then dipped it in hairs, and the hairs cover every surface. Periginia, the scales, the culms, the leaves, the sheaths, just the same. And then one of my very favorite species of these habitats, one that is state listed in Illinois, but certainly more common than many people give it credit for, is Carex woodii. Carex woodii looks a little bit like Carex titanica, which we saw earlier, but with much slenderer spikes. It is in fact a titanical relative. It forms straight vertical shoots in rich forests, and the sheaths are, to my thinking, one of the most beautiful colors in all of nature. That rich red of the sheaths. It's unlike anything I know. It's almost like stained glass. You peel these back and look at them, look at the sun through them. There's no other red quite like it in the sedge world. Okay, now staying in mesic forests where we found ourselves, Carex sprengelii, one of the most striking and knowable woodland sedges, characterized by having these periginium with round bodies and long beaks like a volumetric flask. Other droopers in the woods. So it's got these droopy inflorescences. There are other species with droopy inflorescences in the woods, things like Carex chrysillima, with its purple bases and its beaded necklace-like inflorescences, and its look-alike Carex arctata. This is a little bit cheating to add this in here. This is more of a northern species, but it grows in UW-Madison Arboretum where it's planted, so I threw it in as well. Both of these with the Periginia all beaded up like this, like little beads on a necklace. Very distinctive, nothing you can mix them up with. And they are definitely woodland species. This look is almost always limited to woodland species. Now you can recognize these two and distinguish them from one another because Carex chrysillima has typically gynocandrous terminal spikes. Arctata does not. And Carex chrysillima has no beak. Carex arctata has a long, slender beak and a little stipe at the base, a little stalk. There is another species in this group that is a boreal forest species that I want to show you because it's such a weirdo. I think it's fair to count this because I have grown this in my yard in Madison, so I know other people could too. This is Carex cinnamonensis. You find it on the forest floor. I found this at Nicolay National Forest. And it looks really, really unobtrusive. You're like, oh, look at these green leaves. And you're like, what the heck is going on here? These are the culms. And look at what the culms are doing. They're shooting across the forest floor to a meter or more and growing a plantlet at the tip. It's like a spider plant creeping across the forest floor. Up to a meter is the longest I've ever seen. Okay, I think our last habitat here is bottomland forest. This is Avoca savanna. You also find these kinds of species that we're about to look at around ephemeral ponds in rich forest. This is one in Maple Grove Forest Preserve, DuPage County. Carex tribuloides. Carex tribuloides is another one of the ovales with flattened scale-like perigynia. And Carex projecta. These are close relatives that both like to grow in rich forests. Carex tribuloides more in bottomlands. Carex projecta more in northern mesic forests, preferably depressions within them. They both share a really interesting characteristic. They both have elongated vegetative culms. These are shoots that are leafy with true nodes and internodes, and they serve an important role. The plants are just different in form, right, overall size, but both of them have these thickened sheaths, and the vegetative culms here, whether they're growing on a log or in the forest, produce shoots from the nodes that play a role in vegetative reproduction. So they serve as stolons in a group that doesn't have really well-developed elongate rhizomes. Here you see them spreading around in the woods in Nicolay National Forest. And these same adaptations are found even in California. Here's Carex harfortii, where the vegetative culms in point rays play a role in getting them up through raspberry brambles. Of all things, here's the elongate vegetative culms. And there you can see one, sorry, sending up shoots. Once it's gotten to the top of the raspberry bramble, it sends up shoots to capture the light. Both of these are related to a species with really great bullet-shaped spikes. This is Carex muskingdomensis. Does really well in rain gardens. Does really well in ornamental plantings as well. Very strongly developed vegetative shoots and very pronounced spikes. Okay, in the bottomland forest, there's a cluster of species that have inflated perigynia. Again, do really well in rain gardens. Do really well at the base of a runoff from your roof, even if it's not a proper rain garden. Carex lupulina is one of them. And Carex tuckermanii, which is, this may be state listed. I've never seen people use this in a garden setting. I don't see why it wouldn't do well. Okay, and then we move into the wettest of habitats, places where you find things like Carex stipata, with its almost fox-like sedge in appearance. It's got these compound spikes, really spongy-based perigynia, and very rough culms. Carex sartwellii, forming massive swards in sedge meadows and wet prairies with very distinctive green nerved inner bands of the leaf sheath. Carex comosa, one of a few bottlebrush sedges that we have, which forms really big clumps at the edges of standing water, or even with its feet in standing water. And its close relative, Carex hystracina, the porcupine sedge, with much smaller spikes. More distantly related to these, but always found in wetlands, Carex gynandra and Carex crinida. These are actually close relatives of tussock sedge, which we'll come back to in a moment. The lake sedge, which forms massive swards in standing water. Carex utriculata, which also forms these stands in standing water. and Carex trichocarpa, which I show is partially a cautionary tale. You can buy Carex trichocarpa at many native plant nurseries. It's a great native plant. This particular set of photos is from Governor Dodge State Park in Wisconsin. But I planted one plant in our rain garden in our backyard, and now that plant fills up about 40 square feet of our backyard and has crept over to our neighbor's yard. So be careful. It's a very successful wetland species, related to a couple of other oddities, Carex aetherides with these great hairy sheaths, and Carex lavaconica with these bizarrely veiny sheaths. And finally, we get the true tussock sedge, Carex stricta, one of the first species that people learn, with these ladder-like fibrils forming great tussocks out in sedge meadows with several close relatives. Things like Carex aquatilis, which forms floating mats at the edges of lakes. Carex haydenii, which is common in wet prairies. Okay, so finally we come to part 3 of the talk. So that was your walk through the sedges. Briefly, the question that always comes up is, why are there so many Carex species? I just want to present a little bit of work from the Global Carex group that was led by Santiago Martin Bravo, Daniel Spalink, Pedro Jimenez Mejias, and a group of us who call ourselves the Global Carex group. We organized in 2011 as a global group to work on this big genus, 2,000 species worldwide, and we envisioned a really grand sort of idea of a cycle of identifying gaps in our knowledge, collaborating in sampling, so sharing lots and lots of material, sequencing lots of material, and then using that in a sort of iterative process to revise the classification of the genus and move on to new questions. And in fact, that is what we've been doing. So some of the work that I showed at the very beginning of this talk, some of those publications, these are Global Carex Group publications. But I want to highlight one of the outcomes of this work. We sequenced about 4,000 or 4,400 individuals from within the genus Carex, representing about 2,500 species, 1,500 species. So a lot of the 2,000 species have been sampled to date. We've had a number of meetings. This is our meeting in 2017 at the Morton Arboretum, where we discussed a new classification for the genus as a whole that will be coming out this year, the Journal of Systematics and Evolution. But one of the outcomes of this work was we did a great big phylogeny of 1,400, not 1,500, of 1,400 Carex taxa from all the traditional sections, right? And use this to ask the question, can we understand why there are differences in diversification rates, in the numbers of species, and how rapidly species are evolving in different groups? And it turns out to be complicated. So we found, first of all, that yes, Carex, as has been suggested, arose in East Asia, right? And then migrated to the rest of the world. But that migration history was not straightforward. There's a huge amount of asymmetrical migrations out of East Asia into Western Europe, into North America, into Oceania, and back again, constantly moving around. So that when you look at North American species, they're not all together in one lineage. As we looked at earlier, there are 4 different subgenera in Carex that are included in the North American Carex flora. And equally important, there are all these shifts in species diversification. So when you look at this phylogeny, what you're looking at, this is a snapshot of the sedge tree of life. Branches that are blue have a slower rate of diversification. Fewer species are formed per million years. The hotter colors, like Carex sectionovalis down here, have more species per million years that are evolved. And when you look for a pattern, what you find is that every one of these radiations has a different story. We haven't been able to explain it quite yet. What does hold is that the rate of diversification, right, no matter how you analyze it, undergoes an increase fairly recently. Most of the diversity of sedges that we see today arose within the last 5 to 10 million years. So why are there so many sedges in a nutshell? And again, it depends what group you ask. Phacocysts, the group that includes tussock sedge, Carex stricta, Carex haydenii, Carex aquatilis, hybridization, rampant hybridization in otherwise a genus where there's almost no hybridization, leading to, in some cases, species of hybrid origin. Copresia, one of these unispicate groups, the one that gave rise to Carex jamesii, which we talked about earlier, Carex bachii, which you might know. This arose as a consequence of priority effects in the Himalayas. And Carex ovalis, the one I've been raving about that I did my PhD work on, appears to all be about chromosome evolution, which is driving lineage diversification, whether you look at species or at whole clades. So the brief answer is we don't know why there are so many sedges in a global sense, but we do have a robust understanding of this background history of the evolution of sedges, right? And with about 60% sampling of species, we have a framework for the sexual reclassification. That's a paper that's coming out this year, so watch for it, it'll be exciting. And this relationship between biogeography, ecology, and diversification rates. The question of why we have so many sedges in the first place, it's elusive, right? But it's the fundamental question right now, I think, for sedge biology. And we have what we need to answer it. So whether you are appreciating sedges in the field by collecting, like Tony Rezicek is doing here in Mexico, or whether you're planting them in your own yard, like a group of volunteers was doing with us in 2013 or 2012, when we planted our sedge garden. We had a beautiful sedge garden at the Arboretum for a few years before it became too onerous to maintain. I hope that you take time to enjoy sedges. I mean, understanding sedges gives us a real view into the world that is extremely nuanced. Sedges are highly diverse and beautiful, and they've brought me a lot of joy. So I've enjoyed talking with you about them, and I'm happy to entertain questions. And I apologize, it is 8:15, my friends, and I'm here for questions. I apologize for going so badly over. I appreciate your understanding.
Okay, if anyone has a question, just unmute yourself and ask your question. That was a lot of information.
This is Ted. Are there any sedges that compete with reed canary grass?
And that's a great question. I don't know whether any sedges. I saw Owen Boyle was on this call. Is Owen still here? Because I bet Owen has an answer to this one, or would have his finger closest to an answer to that. Owen, you still on?
Hey, yes.
Hey, what's happening? How are you doing?
Hey, Andrew. Good. The answer is no. Unfortunately, no.
Yeah. I was thinking of Rich Henderson's place. But you know what? He had cordgrass in there. Have you seen Rich Henderson's place?
Oh yeah, long time ago. It's amazing.
Yeah, but no, I've never seen. The only thing that I think that would stand a chance if you were combining it with management and then you wanted to put an aggressive sedge in there, I would think of something like Carex trichocarpa. If it was even wetter, Carex utriculata, but I think if it was that wet, you wouldn't have a reed canary grass problem. I think trichocarpa would be in the same habitats though, but I don't think. Yeah. So Owen, have they done work trying to manage it by just outcompeting?
Yes, but it always involves trees and a lot of shade.
Sorry.
Thanks.
Good
It's
question,
okay.
Ted. Any other questions?
Jerry, this is Janet. Just to let you know, we have 2 Carex in our plant sale, Carex rosea, and if I pronounce it correctly, Carex hystericina.
Both wonderful sedges. So if you've got a woodland, the Carex rosea is going to tolerate a wide range of woodland conditions. It'll do well in fairly dense shade, it'll do well in sparser shade. But if you get into true savanna, it won't thrive. Yeah, that's great. And then Carex hystracina usually likes it a little bit more calcareous, but I have seen it doing well with cultivation, sort of like maintained in a rain garden. So depending on what kind of soils you've got, especially if you've got gravelly soils, it might do okay.
Great.
Andrew, did you give permission for us to post this on our website, the recording of this?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Very much on the spot, but because
No,
we
you're more than-
did record it, so with your permission, we will put a MP3 on our website so people can go back and watch it again and again and
Yeah.
again.
Certainly, please feel free to. Thanks for asking.
Any more questions?
Actually, I have one. Dr. Hip, I have combined pen sedge, Carex rosea, Springelii, and a white-tipped Carex, and I've forgotten the name of it. I've given up trying to grow grass underneath this particular area, and it's doing well. Is there another sedge I can add to that just for diversity?
What kind of soils do you have?
Well, there's a lot of, at that point, it's woodland. There's a lot of oak leaves, so there's some duff that my jumping worms haven't gotten to yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I hear two things that you might try that would be fun, and I think would stand a fighting chance there. One is Carex herdifolia. Carex herdifolia seems to me to do fine in a broad range of forest. It likes bona fide forest. It doesn't want to be out of the shade too far, but it seems to tolerate some disturbance, and it seems to get around. The other one is Carex jamesii. I've really become taken with Carex jamesii since I've been in the Chicago region, and it's pretty widespread. It's got a nice look to it. Let me just pop open. I can share my screen again real quick and just.
How big are these guys?
Well, no, neither one of them's any too big. Yeah, you wouldn't have to worry about that. Let's see, Carex jamesii. I can show you. I really love this Carex jamesii, and I suspect you would as well. And again, so here it is. Let's see. Oh, that's not a good photo of it. I feel like I've got some photos of it in situ. Like here it is with here it is. You can imagine your oak leaves sort of packed around it. So here it is in the fall. And it does do a little bit of color turning. And then you see how it's forming this little mop top. You'll get these all over in the woods. And in midwinter, they'll be popping up through, look like somebody's just little head crown right there. But I think these Periginia are just, to me, just showstoppers. I mean, these are really gorgeous little Periginia, and they give your garden a little extra interest, while providing you a little bit more phylogenetic diversity there. Yeah, I'm all for jamesii. I would try jamesii and herdifolia.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, just for fun. Let me know how it works. I'm curious to see, because I haven't tried growing either one of these.
I'll give it a try.
Okay.
Awesome.
If there are
I have
maybe
one
one
more.
more question.
Yeah, I do. Andrew, would you send me a list of the species you covered so I can get the spelling right in the write-up?
Ooh, that would be, yeah. You know what, Lisa? Let me just send you in fact, I'm going to just send it to everybody right now. I'm going to put it in the chat. I'm going to put a link to the presentation I just gave, and the names are right in there.
Awesome. Thank you
Here
so
we
much.
go. If you sell it, I want a cut.
Okay.
I'm sure people are dying to buy this presentation. I'm just kidding. Yeah, please feel free to use it as you see fit.
All right, thank you.
No problem.
Hey, well, we appreciate,
Yeah, I
Well,
appreciate all you guys coming. Thank you. Thank you all so much thank you for having me. And thank you everybody for attending. This was really delightful. And if you run into questions, don't hesitate to email. I'll put my email address in the chat. You can always email questions, and I'm also on Twitter. And I'm easily accessible there. So either place is a fine place to reach me.
You might want to also mention that Dr. Hip has authored a book on sedges that was
Yeah.
2008, I think.
Yes. Yes. Here it is. Yeah, this is it's a useful introduction to sedges. It's available through University of Wisconsin Press. The illustrations are by my wife Rachel. And it's designed to be a usable introduction. So I do think it accomplishes that. I think it works as like a field guide. So you get these field guidey type illustrations and introduction that really help you get some traction on the genus. And then it's got technical keys as well that are designed to avoid unnecessary technicalities where they can avoid it.
Jenny, maybe you could post that on our Facebook page or remind us of that in the newsletter,
The book,
the book.
okay.
Well, with
thank
that,
you
I
again.
think we will leave the program. And again, thank you, Andrew, and thank you for everybody who stuck with us.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, everyone.